Avram Shannon will address us on seeing the New Testament in its several surrounding cultural contexts. Dr. Avram R. Shannon is an assistant professor in the Department of Ancient Scripture at Brigham Young University, Provo. He received his undergraduate education at Brigham Young University, earning his BA in Ancient Near Eastern Studies, specializing in Hebrew. He studied at the University of Oxford before attending The Ohio State University, where he earned a PhD in Near Eastern languages and cultures, with a graduate specialization in religions of the ancient Mediterranean. His dissertation research was focused on the idea of Rabbinic Judaism as a religion of the broader ancient Mediterranean world. Specifically, he addressed the idea of idolatry in the Mishnah and Tosefta, showing how the earliest rabbinic sages understood biblical law in light of the rituals that were going on around them. A key contribution of his work is the thesis that the entire rabbinic understanding of ritual derives from the ordinances and practices of the Jerusalem temple. His continuing research deals with the ways communities understand scripture and law in changed social circumstances. Dr. Shannon is primarily a grammarian and a philologist and admits he loves reading grammars. He sees the book of Hebrews, with its elegant Greek and its focus on the Old Testament and priesthood, as a book at the confluence of ancient ideas of religion, and admires how it takes concepts found in the Law of Moses and provides an inspired adaptation of them for its audience of Christian believers.
Hello, my name is Dr. Avram R. Shannon. I teach in the Department of Ancient Scripture at Brigham University in Provo, and I'm here to talk today about my contribution to the BYU New Testament Commentary introductory volume. So my contribution is called Other Cultural Contexts, and really what that points us to is the recognition that it's not a single, it's actually a collection of essays on a wide variety of topics. One of the things I feel very strongly about in reading the New Testament, really all of Scripture, but the New Testament, is this recognition in the Book of Mormon. Nephi reminds us that the Lord speaks to people in their own language unto their understanding. This recognition that everything in Scripture happens in contexts, both in terms of the experiences of people being talked about, as well as in terms of the experiences of those who are doing the writing. And the purpose of my essays is across the New Testament is to deal with individual issues that come up in multiple scriptural books that provide these kinds of contexts for the scriptural, for the scriptural authors and for us as readers in the latter days. And again, there are a number of these essays that I work through. The first one deals with this notion of eschatology. Now, eschatology comes from a Greek word, eschaton, that means the end. And so eschatology is it is that part of theological and doctrinal discourse that is concerned with the afterlife and especially the end of the world. And so a group's eschatology is how a group understands and anticipates that end. Now, there are lots of different ways this can take: notions of destruction of the wicked, return to a longed-for primeval event. Generally speaking, the more difficulties a group is feeling, the more likely they are to sort of move in eschatological ways of thinking. An example in the Churches of Christ of Latter-day Saints is the relative, during times of relative prosperity, we get a little bit less eschatological. During difficult times, like the Utah War and the persecution surrounding plural marriage, we tend to talk in ways that are more eschatological. Related to eschatology, but not quite the same thing, is the genre of apocalyptic. This genre of ancient literature actually gets its name from the revelation of John in the New Testament, which is called the Apocalypse in Greek. This literature is associated with the notion of the current world order being overturned in favor of a proper, divinely appointed order. And you can see that because it tends to have notions of sort of, this feeds into eschatological thinking, there are some clear overlaps between eschatological and apocalyptic modes. In the New Testament, the Christian writers there are clearly eschatological, and especially something like Matthew 24 and 25, which are explicitly about the end of the world. That's probably the strongest example, but you also see it in the Gospel of John, where Jesus speaks of the last day on numerous occasions. I then move on and I talk about notions of orality and literacy. In the ancient world was primarily an oral one. We, in the modern age, live in a world where literacy is primary. I could write something on a piece of paper and hand it to you and fully expect that you would be able to read it, because I presume a kind of literacy that is the norm. That's not the way it is in the ancient world. And even stuff that's written down, I mean, since scripture literally means written stuff, there's a fluidity between the writing and the written. So for example, for ease of transmission, Paul's letters would be written down, but when they came to the various communities, they would have been read out loud. And so the Christians would have experienced them as oral texts rather than as written texts. You even see this in the New Testament, where when Jesus announces himself in Luke chapter 4, when he gets from the synagogue, it says very explicitly there, he gets up for to read, to use the KJV there. The other Jews in the synagogue would not be following along with Jesus in their individual copies of the scripture. They would be experiencing it as Jesus reads to them. Again, in fact, part of this, even in Hebrew, the etymological root of the word to read actually means to recite or to call out. Reading is fundamentally something you do socially and you do out loud. And so when we think about this notion of scripture and reading scripture, we need to think of it, again, in all of these scriptures, with this fluid notion of oral versus literacy, which feeds into the next point I sort of talk about, which is the idea of language. There are lots of languages in the Roman, in Roman Judea and Roman Galilee. Because of the Holy Land, it's kind of a corridor for different empires. And each of these empires and societies kind of left their imprints on the land and the people. And of course, a great example of this is the plaque put up, mentioned Luke 23:38 and John 19:20, that's inscribed, it says, with Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. And because this plaque on the cross seems to be intended to be read by random people, it gives us insights into, there's certain basic sense of literacy, but also gives insight into the language that the Roman government expected the subjects walking along the road in Jerusalem to be able to read. Now, of course, the original language of the Jews is Hebrew. The Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, is written in Hebrew. It's the language of scripture. It's also a living language, as we see from the Mishnah and the Bar Kokhba letters. So in this period, people are speaking Hebrew. However, when the Jews came back from the Babylonian exile, they brought with them the Aramaic language, which is a language closely related to Hebrew, and there's influence both ways. So you get Mishnaic Hebrew that has a lot of Aramaisms in it. You get Jewish Aramaic with a lot of Hebraisms in it. When we find quotations in the New Testament from Jesus in the language here, they appear to be in Aramaic. So something like his statement in the Gospel of Mark, Talitha Kumi, that's Aramaic. That means little girl, get up. Now there are times New Testament authors, especially John, will identify a statement as being Hebrew when it's clearly Aramaic, suggesting that there's a little bit of flexibility in that. Jesus lived in a world, however, where Hebrew and Aramaic existed side by side. And so, honestly, an inscription in Hebrew would have been read by an Aramaic speaker and vice versa if it was simple enough. Outside the Semitic languages, of course, there are the languages of imperial control and the surrounding society. I mean, Latin is, of course, the native language of Rome, but for most of the experiences in the Eastern Empire, where Judea and Galilee are, Greek is the language of government. And it becomes this sort of common language spoken all throughout the Eastern Roman Empire. In fact, even upper-class Romans, because it's kind of this language of literature, would have been tutored in Greek. And because of that, Greek becomes the language of missionary work in the New Testament. It is the idiom of Paul's epistles. It is the idiom that the Gospels are written in. And so although there is this underlying Semitic, Aramaic, maybe Hebrew notion in the authors and the early Christians, the language of the New Testament is fundamentally a Greek language. I mean, a Greek text. So it's a Semitic text in a Greek language in a lot of ways. After that, we're talking about, we talk about kind of situating the social world a little bit, talking about the various varieties of Judaism that existed in the first temple period. You know many of these already, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And really the point of this is just to recognize both the differences that are to be had in the cultural context of the New Testament, but also to kind of situate you in the recognition that, or readers, and the recognition that the New Testament, in the New Testament period, Judaism, they had more in common than they had apart, right? A Pharisee and a Sadducee, and frankly, an early Christian, and an Essene, and the Qumran community, whether the same thing or not, any of these groups would have more in common with each other than they would with the Syro-Canaanite woman mentioned in the Gospels. So when we talk about the differences, there are clear differences. The Pharisees had their belief in oral law and in spreading out sort of temple notions among the people. The Sadducees had, their temple-focused ideas. The Essenes, of course, split off from everybody. But as you look at these, but again, recognizing both their differences do not change the fact that they all accept, for example, Moses' law is God's law. In fact, even early Christians will accept that up into, within the confines of the disagreements we see in the New Testament. Of all the Jewish parties, the Pharisees seem to be closest to the early Christians. And of course, the most famous Pharisee who becomes a Christian is Paul himself. And so when you think about these groups, recognizing, again, I cover them obviously in greater depth in my little piece here, but just to help New Testament readers recognize that as Christianity begins, likely to outsiders, especially the Romans, it's going to be another one of these varieties of Judaism. And again, share more in common with other parts of Judaism than it did with the surrounding Gentile world. And then from there, I go on to talk about what religion looks like in the surrounding Gentile world. And the first thing I note is that, and this is actually a really key thing, and something that's, I hope, really gets emphasized strongly in my piece here, but just as a big takeaway for all of us listening right now, the recognition that religion as such is a relatively modern concept. When we talk about religion, we're not really talking about a concept. Again, they have lots of things in the ancient world that identify as religion, but they're all bound up together, especially in a lot of the activities we call religious, were part and parcel with the social and political life of those living in the orbit of Roman power. And so in this Hellenized world, you had mystery cults alongside official civic cults, magicians and itinerant street philosophers that ply their wares to a mixed populace of a Hellenized world. Gods from all over the Mediterranean worshiped side by side, Isis and Aphrodite, Jupiter and Baal Shemin. It was into this world of religious pluralism and movement that the promised Messiah of Judaism came, that was produced. And so, with one of the primary things to know about religion, again, I have it in square quotes here, within Rome, is its variety, but also the fact that for most people, it was all facets of a single kind of system. And so we think about this, and this will then feed into Paul's missionary experiences, but it also feeds into a lot of the struggles that Judaism faced. And because for most of the New Testament period, the Romans did not recognize a large distinction between Judaism and Christianity that early Christians would have faced, because it would have been a separate system within the broader with it. All of this is because of the commandment against the creation of images and the worship of God, other gods in Exodus 20. Judaism could not and would not integrate with non-Jewish religious practices. And even when you start getting Gentile converts, there, of course, in the Great Jerusalem Council in Acts, one of the things that Gentile converts are forbidden to do is to eat food offered to idols. And so they are still within, even though they're not living in the law of Moses as converts, they are still part of this kind of part of and against the broader Roman world. And again, there are these notions of every fine place. I talk about mystery cults. I talk about the emperor worship. I talk about how some of these specific ideas of the religious experience, what we would call religious experience in the broader Greco-Roman and Jewish world, interact with and find their way into the discourse and the experiences of the New Testament. Talk about, Ephesian Artemis, the girl with the Pythian spirit, all kinds of fun stuff with that. And again, with the goal, as always, to situate New Testament readers in the world that the New Testament came out of, because this is one of those places where it can be really, really helpful to us to understand how the ancients are thinking and how that's a little bit different from what we're doing. Remembering that as moderns, even as Latter-day Saints, we inherit 2,000 years of Christian history. And because of that, we're used to thinking of religion in a way that is influenced largely by the Christianization, especially of Western culture. And so to really get behind what's going on in the broader world of the ancient world, the New Testament, the matrix of the New Testament, we really have to step back and look at how they think about ancient religion. And so I try to talk a lot about that. So the final thing I talk about, I deal with social issues, which is another key place where the ancient world is just different from ours. And so things like gender dynamics, and part of this is, this is a very, very important and a subject that we need to be careful about, because of the scriptures are largely written by men from a male point of view and are generally male facing, it can sometimes obscure the female perspective. It would be, on one hand, a mistake to downplay the importance of figures like Mary and Martha, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of Jesus, within the scriptures. On the other hand, acknowledging the real power and roles these women play in early Christianity, it would also be disservice to suggest that the prevalence somehow covers the fact that the New Testament is largely unconcerned with the female experience. And the writings of Paul, in particular, for example, have elements that have been used in the past to explain, or even right now, to explain or justify the oppression or the ill treatment of women. This is contrary to the will of God, and so it's especially important when discussing gender roles and women to keep the cultural background informing the New Testament in our minds. And this way we can be, what does Moroni say? We can be more wise than the ancient had been. Generally speaking, women were not property in the ancient Mediterranean world, but there were elements of their life, especially in Judaism, where parts of their lives were treated as property. And this kind of ambiguity really dictated a lot of the life of women in the ancient world, and especially the ancient Jewish matrix. Notions of marriage, and of course, part of this is Jesus sort of pushing against this a little bit and saying marriage is not just, because again, in the Old Testament, marriage law is primarily property law, if you could go to Exodus and places like that. But of course, Jesus in Matthew 19 reminds us, what God has put together, let no person part asunder, i.e. for Jesus, marriage is more than just property law. And so we try to work through some of these issues to get a sense of what's going on here and how that feeds into how we're to read what are in some ways some of the more difficult parts of the New Testament. I talk also a little bit about the notions of slavery and things like that, and how social order is both sort of found in the New Testament, how the New Testament is really radical in its view on the change of the ancient social order. And so as I kind of tie things up here, I just want to tell you, one, how much I appreciate the New Testament, how much I appreciate how God has worked through these people to help us receive messages that we need in the latter days today. I really appreciate the fact that the inspiration that went into these books. I appreciate the way that they navigated their worlds. For one thing, even some of those things are different, and part of the purpose of my little essays and my contribution to this to the introductory volume is this way of making the strange familiar and the familiar strange. But as a way of making the strange familiar, the familiar strange, recognizing that in my own experiences, I'm also trying to navigate this world I live in alongside the revelation that I know as a disciple of Jesus Christ I can receive. And reading the New Testament in this way and recognizing what they're doing, and as again, the felicitous language of Moroni, recognizing how merciful the Lord has been unto the children of men, really increases my appreciation for the New Testament, for the gospel writers, for the earliest Christians, and for their dedication to following Jesus Christ, their promised Messiah. And I hope as you read through the New Testament commentary and as you read through our introductory volume, that you will also find ways to see how understanding how embedded the New Testament is in the ancient world can deepen your faith that this truly is God's work. Thank you very much.